Alright, here we are in Maya 2011. Before we get started, I want to go over some of the settings and preferences in Maya. So let's go under the Display tab to the Polygon settings and make sure that soft and hard edges, texture borders, and creased edges is all selected. And really quickly, I'll show you why that's important. Let's go ahead and make a box here. Notice that all the edges of the box have a solid line. By default, this is how Maya displays soft and hard edges. But what we want is the soft edges to be displayed with a dotted line. And so making those changes to the Maya preferences is really important because we don't want soft edges to look just like hard edges do. Okay, so after we've done that, the next thing to adjust is our grid. What I'm going to do here is play with the grid numbers until I get a major grid line every 8 units. And this is important because we want to create pieces that kind of follow the power of 2, meaning they're 2 units long, 4 units long, 8 units long, and by default a major grid line at 10 doesn't work as well as having one at 8. And so now that we've taken care of those details, the next thing to do is to get our concept art in the scene, and we're going to do that through image planes. And I did this by going up to the View tab, selecting image planes, and then browsing for our concept art. Now that I have it in here, I'm going to go ahead and adjust the width and height a little bit. Then we will offset it so it's not sitting at the origin. Because we're going to do the majority of our building at the origin, we want this to kind of be out of the way, but still accessible so we can just rotate the camera and look at it and compare to what we're doing. That looks like that will probably work. We can adjust them later. And let's go back up to the View tab and import the black and white sketch. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to make this a fixed image plane, adjust the width and height, and then get it out of the way. Now, there is something you should know if you're going to use image planes like this. If you're on a slower machine, for some reason they can sometimes really slow down your scene. If that's the case, you can always go with the more old school way of just importing your picture and mapping it onto a plane. Image planes are a little bit more dynamic in that they stay front facing and they're really easy to find, but they can be a little bit tricky to set up, and sometimes they just get in the way. But they are a good way to have your concept art at your fingertips. So I would encourage you to try them out and see if they work for you. So what we're going to be doing here for the rest of the chapter is blocking out our scene. And so to do this, I'm going to start out with a plane, add a few more subdivisions to it, and we'll go ahead and duplicate it. And this is going to be our ground area for this level we're going to build. So getting started here, the general idea is going to be to use Maya's basic primitives just to kind of block out the scene here. And so starting with a primitive cube right now, all I'm trying to do is figure out what's going to go where and roughly what size it'll be. And in this initial blockout, I try and be as precise as possible. You might have noticed that I just selected some of the vertices and snapped them to the grid. And if you really think about it, being precise is very important, especially at this stage of the game, where all I'm trying to do is just figure out where things are going to sit. If we're nice and precise now, then everything else will kind of follow that level of precision. But on the flip side, if we start out just kind of free-forming everything, just throwing things all over the place and being messy, then the scene going forward will be messy as well. So I would suggest when you're blocking out a scene like this, if you choose to do this, this is by no means something you have to do. It's just something I like to do to kind of wrap my head around what I'm going to be doing. If you start out like this, you might as well be precise. And what I mean when I'm talking about being precise is that you're building things on the grid. Edges and verts aren't just floating in space, that they're kind of snapped to grid points. And that objects that you're building don't just have random sizes. For example, if I was going to build a wall, I wouldn't make it, 7.2 meters wide by 1.333 meters high. I'd go ahead and make it 8 by 2, something like that. Probably during the course of this DVD, I'll end up sounding like a broken record when I talk about building on the grid. But games really benefit from this kind of building, especially if you are in a workflow where you're creating modular chunks that other people will use to kind of assemble a level for you. That makes it even more important that you use precision. So at this point, just using primitive boxes in Maya, I've determined where I want everything to sit, how far apart everything should be spaced. And if we were in an actual game engine here, I'd probably run the player around just to make sure that everything didn't seem too big or too small. And so once I figure out where the big shapes are going to sit, then the next stage is to kind of refine it a little further. And that's what I'm doing right now. Keep in mind that although you may not see it, I'm constantly referring to the concept art here. And right now, at this stage of the game, none of this modeling is what we're going to eventually end up with. My main goal here is just to determine where the big landmarks are. I'm doing just enough modeling to figure out where things should sit and roughly how big they'll be. You could think of it as more of a planning session, or kind of a blueprint for where I'll end up doing the final modeling. Sometimes I may start with some of these pieces, but mostly I'll just build on top of them. But the thing to take away from this is that when you do this kind of seam block out, you're really making your modeling down the road a lot easier. For example, when we go to model the final geometry, we'll already have determined where things are going to go, roughly what size they'll be, and a lot of the broad strokes and the scene composition will already be there for us. I really think as an environment artist, it's too much to kind of tackle the scene layout at the same time you're trying to build high-res pieces. You really need to do things in stages and in passes. Or in my experience, you'll just become overwhelmed, or you might have a scene that has really good assets, but the layout's not good. So in a nutshell, tackle your scene layout and composition early on, and it'll just make your task much easier and you won't have to worry about it so much in the future. So presently what I'm working on is the building to the right-hand side of the arches that you see in the concept art. And all I'm trying to do is figure out what's going to go where, what can be reused. I'm just going to plan out where everything's going to sit. Now, it doesn't mean that this won't change in the future. A lot of this will end up shifting around, maybe becoming a little bit bigger, a little bit taller. But I'll feel a lot better about knowing what the task at hand is doing this kind of work. So right now I'm not using a whole lot of fancy modeling techniques. I've just started with primitives. I'm selecting verts and edges and just pushing and pulling things around. And while I'm doing this, I try and plan for how I'm going to actually build this environment. If you didn't know already, building something for games is a little bit different than building something for television or movies. There's only a certain amount of resources that you have, and everything has to run in real time. And so you have to balance the amount of memory that you have available to you and the amount of processing power. And if you build a scene that's too complicated, it's not going to fit in memory and it probably won't run at a decent frame rate. And that's one of the things that makes working on games very difficult, is it's not only just an art task, it's also a technical task as well. And so one of the things I want to accomplish when I'm doing this block out is not only determining where everything's going to sit and vaguely what it'll look like, I need to also figure out how I'm going to build this, because we don't have the resources available to build everything as a custom piece. There's going to have to be a fair amount of reuse. I'll probably end up building a bunch of tileable trim pieces and tileable textures that just get reused around the scene. And then at some point there will be totally custom pieces here. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out now, is what balance I need to have to pull this off. How much of it needs to be tileable, how much can be reused, stuff like that. It's important to keep in mind that every game engine is different. For this DVD, I'm going to kind of lean towards this being built for a more higher-end system like the PS3. The amount of polygons I'll probably be using probably wouldn't work for, let's say, a Wii game, for example. But really, that's all relative. Every system is different and every engine is different. The thing to do is just apply the things I show you in this DVD to whatever game engine you're working on. And so right now this building is getting pretty close to having its block out done. I think it has a good size, and I've called out most of the interesting elements that I want to model. So I'm going to move on to this arch area now, and while still looking at the concept, just kind of call out its big landmarks, very similar to how we did the last building. Again, I know it's not very pretty, but the important things are figured out, like where the arch is going to sit, how big it's going to be, what some of the little details are and where they might sit. For example, this hose here. And while still trying to be as precise as possible, I'm just trying to rough in what the major landmarks and features of this building are. That being the roof right there at the top. And again, this is just the broad strokes. Figuring this out now, we won't have to figure it out later. We can just build cool looking assets. And that's all I really wanted to show in this chapter, was my process, how I go about roughing out a scene, blocking it out, and how I use that to kind of plan how I'll build things. And really a lot of that's based on experience, knowing what you can and can't do. So whether you're a total beginner or someone who's been building levels for a long time, this kind of block out really has its purpose. And so for the sake of time, I've skipped ahead a little bit just to show you what the final block out ended up looking like, and then comparing it to the concept art just to make sure that everything's on the same page and I'm still getting across the feel and look that Cecil wanted.